The morning mist hung thick over the Carolina coast as merchant sailors peered nervously through the fog, their hands trembling as they gripped the rigging. Then they saw it. A massive ship emerging from the grey veil, like something conjured from their darkest nightmares. Black smoke billowed around the figure standing at the bow, his enormous frame silhouetted against the pale dawn. Hemp rope fuses burned slowly in his braided beard, sending tendrils of smoke curling around a face that seemed to belong more to demon than man. This was Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard, and the sight of him was enough to make grown sailors weep with terror. But what made Blackbeard truly terrifying wasn't just his theatrical appearance or his reputation for violence. It was the calculated, methodical way he broke his enemies without even drawing his sword. While other pirates of the Golden Age tortured their victims with knives and flames, Blackbeard had perfected something far more sinister. He had weaponized fear itself, creating a system of psychological warfare so effective that entire crews would surrender at the mere sight of his flag. Today, we're diving deep into the horrifying methods Blackbeard used to dominate the seas. And I promise you, the reality is far more disturbing than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. We'll explore how this master manipulator turned the human mind into his greatest weapon, examine the innovative torture devices he created that left victims begging for death, and reveal the shocking truth about what really happened to those who dared to resist him. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why Blackbeard's name still sends chills down the spine of anyone who truly knows maritime history. The story begins not with Edward Teach's rise to infamy, but with the world that created him. The early 18th century Caribbean was a lawless frontier where violence was currency and mercy was a luxury few could afford. The golden age of piracy had transformed these tropical waters into humanity's greatest nightmare, where merchant vessels disappeared without trace and entire colonial ports lived in constant terror of black flags on the horizon. But even in this realm of unimaginable brutality, Blackbeard stood apart. While his contemporaries like Edward Lowe were content to hack and slash their way to infamy, Teach understood something profound about human nature that would make him the most feared pirate who ever lived. He realized that the anticipation of pain could be more powerful than pain itself, that the right combination of theater and threat could achieve what hours of actual torture might fail to accomplish. The transformation of Edward Teach into Blackbeard was as calculated as it was terrifying. Every element of his appearance was designed to trigger primal fear responses in his victims. He would spend hours before each encounter preparing his horrifying costume, braiding slow-burning hemp matches into his massive black beard until smoke wreathed his face like something emerging from the depths of hell itself. Multiple pistols hung across his chest in leather holsters, their metal gleaming with menace. His cutlass, razor-sharp and stained with the blood of previous encounters, hung at his side like an extension of his murderous intent. The psychological impact of this appearance cannot be overstated. In an age where most sailors were deeply superstitious, believing in sea monsters and supernatural forces, Blackbeard's smoke-wreathed visage would have seemed like an apparition of death itself. Imagine being a simple merchant sailor, perhaps on your first voyage, and suddenly seeing this demonic figure materializing through the morning mist. The sight alone was enough to break the will of hardened seamen who had survived storms and battles across the Atlantic. But Blackbeard's genius lay not just in his appearance, but in the weapons he deployed to create maximum psychological impact. Archaeological excavations of his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, have revealed one of history's most innovative approaches to maritime terrorism. Rather than relying solely on conventional cannonballs, Blackbeard loaded his cannons with a horrifying mixture of lead shot, iron nails, broken glass, and metal scraps. When these improvised weapons exploded across the deck of an enemy vessel, they created a scene of carnage that would have been absolutely traumatic for anyone who witnessed it. The sound alone would have been devastating. Imagine the screaming whistle of hundreds of metal fragments cutting through the air, followed by the sickening impacts as they tore through wood, sail, and flesh. The visual impact would have been even worse. Suddenly, what had been an orderly merchant vessel would be transformed into a scene of destruction, with glass embedded in the masts, nails protruding from the deck, and blood splattered across surfaces that moments before had been pristine. Even more diabolical were the improvised explosive devices Blackbeard created for close-quarters combat. Historical evidence suggests he would fill glass bottles with the same mixture of metal fragments and gunpowder, creating primitive grenades that he would hurl onto enemy decks during boarding actions. The psychological effect of these weapons was devastating. Sailors who survived the initial explosion would find themselves surrounded by glass shards and metal fragments, never knowing when the next blast might tear through their ranks. The brilliance of these weapons lay not just in their physical destructiveness, but in their ability to create an atmosphere of unpredictable terror. Traditional naval combat followed certain understood patterns, but Blackbeard's innovations introduced elements of chaos that completely destabilized his enemy's ability to respond rationally. When faced with weapons that seemed to defy the normal rules of maritime warfare, many crews simply collapsed psychologically before the real fighting even began. Blackbeard's approach to torture was equally calculated and far more sophisticated than the crude methods employed by his contemporaries. While pirates like Edward Lowe were content to inflict immediate physical agony on their victims, Blackbeard understood that the most effective torture targeted the mind rather than the body. He developed a system of psychological pressure that could break even the strongest-willed prisoners without leaving a single physical mark. The process would begin immediately after capture, when prisoners were still in shock from the violent boarding action. Rather than rushing into interrogation or torture, Blackbeard would allow his victims to observe the aftermath of their ship's capture. They would be forced to watch as their vessel was methodically stripped of everything valuable, their cargo redistributed among the pirate crew, their personal possessions examined and either kept or contemptuously discarded. During this period, Blackbeard would position himself where the prisoners could see him clearly, but he would not speak to them directly. Instead, he would conduct conversations with his crew about the fate of previous captives, ensuring that every word was clearly audible to his new prisoners. These conversations were carefully scripted psychological warfare, designed to plant seeds of terror about what might happen next. The stories Blackbeard's crew would tell were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. They would speak casually about previous victims who had been difficult or uncooperative, describing in vivid detail the creative punishments that had been devised for them. Some tales would focus on prisoners who had been abandoned on deserted islands with no food or water, left to slowly starve while surrounded by the endless ocean. Others would describe victims who had been keel-hauled repeatedly until their flesh was stripped away by the barnacles covering the ship's hull. But perhaps most effective were the stories about prisoners who had simply vanished. Blackbeard's crew would speak in hushed, mysterious tones about captives who had been taken below deck and never seen again. They would hint at horrible fates without providing specific details, allowing each prisoner's imagination to fill in the gaps with their own worst fears. This technique was devastatingly effective because it forced victims to torture themselves mentally, creating scenarios in their own minds that were often worse than anything Blackbeard might actually have planned. The genius of this approach was that it required minimal resources while achieving maximum psychological impact. Unlike physical torture, which was time-consuming and carried the risk of accidentally killing valuable prisoners before they revealed important information, Blackbeard's psychological methods could break multiple prisoners simultaneously while preserving their ability to provide useful intelligence. As the psychological pressure mounted, Blackbeard would begin to insert himself more directly into his prisoners' experience. He would approach them slowly, his smoke-wreathed face looming over their terrified forms, and begin asking seemingly casual questions about their cargo, their destination, and their ship's defenses. But these interrogations were anything but casual. Every question was designed to probe for weakness, to identify which prisoners might be most susceptible to further pressure. Blackbeard had an almost supernatural ability to read people's psychological states. He could identify within minutes which prisoners were natural leaders who might organize resistance, which were followers who could be turned against their companions, and which were so terrified that they would say anything to avoid further suffering. This psychological profiling allowed him to tailor his approach to each individual prisoner, maximizing the effectiveness of his methods. For prisoners identified as potential leaders, Blackbeard would employ techniques designed to undermine their authority and break their spirit. These individuals would be singled out for special attention, subjected to humiliating treatment in front of their former subordinates. They might be forced to perform degrading tasks or made to watch helplessly as their companions were threatened. The goal was not just to break these leaders individually, but to demonstrate to other prisoners that resistance was futile. The psychological torture would continue for days or even weeks, depending on the information Blackbeard sought and the resistance he encountered. Prisoners would be kept in a state of constant uncertainty about their fate, never knowing whether each day might be their last. They would be given just enough food and water to survive, but never enough to feel secure. Sleep would be interrupted by random checks or meaningless activities designed to prevent prisoners from developing any sense of routine or control over their situation. Throughout this ordeal, Blackbeard would maintain his theatrical persona, appearing before prisoners at unexpected moments wreathed in smoke and shadow. Sometimes he would engage them in seemingly friendly conversation, asking about their families or their hopes for the future. These moments of apparent kindness were actually among the most psychologically devastating, because they gave prisoners hope that was then systematically crushed when Blackbeard's demeanor would suddenly shift back to threatening menace. The most insidious aspect of Blackbeard's psychological warfare was how he turned prisoners against each other. He possessed an almost demonic understanding of human nature, recognizing that people under extreme stress would often sacrifice others to save themselves. This knowledge became the foundation for some of his most effective torture methods, techniques that left no physical scars but shattered minds completely. Blackbeard would begin by identifying the natural hierarchies among his prisoners. In any group of captured sailors, there were always officers and common crew members, experienced hands and newcomers, those with families waiting at home and those with nothing to lose. He would study these relationships carefully, like a predator circling its prey, looking for the fault lines he could exploit to tear the group apart from within. Once he understood the dynamics at play, Blackbeard would start making offers to individual prisoners. These offers were always presented as exclusive opportunities, chances for one person to save themselves while their companions suffered. He might approach a young sailor and whisper that he could go free if he revealed where the ship's real treasure was hidden. To an officer, he might suggest that providing information about naval patrol routes would spare not just himself, but his entire crew. The brilliance of these offers lay not in whether they were genuine, but in the doubt they created. Even if a prisoner rejected Blackbeard's proposition immediately, the knowledge that such an offer had been made would spread through the group like poison. Other prisoners would begin to wonder whether their companions might betray them to save their own lives. Trust would erode, and the natural solidarity that might have helped them resist would crumble under the weight of mutual suspicion. Blackbeard would then escalate the psychological pressure by staging elaborate theatrical performances designed to demonstrate the consequences of resistance. He would select one prisoner, often someone who had shown particular defiance, and subject them to a carefully orchestrated display of apparent torture. The victim would be dragged away from the group while screaming for help, taken to a location where their companions could hear but not see what was happening. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Blackbeard's crew would create sounds suggesting horrific torture was taking place. There would be screams, pleading, the sound of metal against flesh, and eventually, silence. The other prisoners would be left to imagine the worst, their minds filling in details that were often far more horrific than anything that had actually occurred. In many cases, the victim had simply been taken to another part of the ship and told to scream convincingly, then rewarded with extra food for their performance. When the selected prisoner was eventually returned to the group, they would appear to have been severely traumatized, but the nature of their supposed torture would remain deliberately vague. They might sport a few superficial cuts or bruises, easily created without causing real harm, but their most convincing wounds were psychological. They would refuse to speak about their experience, would flinch at sudden movements, and would avoid eye contact with their fellow prisoners. This theatrical torture served multiple purposes. It demonstrated to other prisoners what awaited those who resisted, but more importantly, it created a collaborator within the group. The tortured prisoner, grateful to have escaped real harm and perhaps promised better treatment in exchange for cooperation, would become Blackbeard's eyes and ears among the captives. They would report on conversations, identify prisoners planning resistance, and help maintain the atmosphere of terror that made further torture unnecessary. The psychological pressure would continue to mount as Blackbeard introduced elements of randomness into his treatment of prisoners. Some might be given unexpected privileges, like better food or cleaner sleeping quarters, while others face seemingly arbitrary punishments. This random reward and punishment system was devastatingly effective because it prevented prisoners from understanding the rules governing their situation. When people cannot predict what behavior will lead to reward or punishment, they become psychologically helpless. They stop trying to resist or plan escape attempts because they cannot understand what actions might improve or worsen their situation. This learned helplessness was exactly what Blackbeard sought to create, because helpless prisoners were compliant prisoners. The isolation techniques Blackbeard employed were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply locking prisoners in the ship's hold, he would separate them in ways that maximized psychological distress. Family members would be kept apart, with each knowing that their loved ones were somewhere nearby, but being unable to communicate with them. Officers would be separated from their crews, breaking down the command structures that might organize resistance. But perhaps most cruel was how Blackbeard would isolate prisoners from hope itself. He would ensure that captives received just enough information about the outside world to know that rescue was theoretically possible, but never enough to believe it was likely. They might hear fragments of conversation about naval patrols in the area, or catch glimpses of distant sails on the horizon. But these tantalizing possibilities would always fade away without bringing salvation. The physical conditions Blackbeard maintained for his prisoners were carefully calculated to weaken their resistance without killing them outright. They would be kept in spaces that were cramped enough to be uncomfortable, but not so confined as to cause immediate physical breakdown. The temperature would be maintained at levels that made sleep difficult, but not impossible. Food and water would be provided in quantities sufficient for survival, but insufficient for comfort. These seemingly minor discomforts had a cumulative psychological effect that was far more devastating than dramatic physical torture might have been. Constant low-level suffering wore down prisoners' mental defenses gradually, but relentlessly. They would find themselves obsessing over small comforts they had once taken for granted, like a full meal or a comfortable position for sleeping. This narrowing of focus made them more susceptible to Blackbeard's psychological manipulation. The interrogation techniques Blackbeard used were masterclasses in psychological pressure. Rather than relying on physical pain to extract information, he would create scenarios where prisoners felt compelled to speak in order to relieve psychological tension. He might spend hours asking seemingly innocuous questions about a prisoner's family, their childhood, their hopes and dreams. These conversations would appear almost friendly, creating a false sense of intimacy that made prisoners want to please their captor. Only gradually would Blackbeard begin introducing more sensitive topics. He would ask about the prisoner's ship, its cargo, its destination, but always in the context of the broader conversation about the person's life and experiences. By the time prisoners realized they were being interrogated, they had already revealed far more than they intended. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that victims often felt they were choosing to share information rather than being forced to reveal it. When prisoners did resist his psychological methods, Blackbeard would escalate to more direct forms of pressure, but even these were calculated for maximum psychological impact rather than simple physical pain. He might force a prisoner to watch as their personal possessions were systematically destroyed, each item burned or thrown overboard, while they were powerless to intervene. The destruction of these tangible connections to their former life was often more traumatic than physical violence would have been. The genius of Blackbeard's approach was that it created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate experience of captivity. Prisoners who were eventually released carried psychological scars that lasted for years. They would suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and crippling anxiety whenever they encountered situations that reminded them of their ordeal. More importantly, for Blackbeard's purposes, these traumatized survivors became unwitting agents of his terror campaign. When they returned to their home ports and told their stories, they spread fear far more effectively than any deliberate propaganda campaign could have achieved. Their obvious psychological damage served as proof that Blackbeard's methods were devastatingly effective, discouraging other sailors from resisting if they found themselves in similar situations. The ripple effects of Blackbeard's psychological warfare extended throughout the maritime community. Ship captains would brief their crews about what to expect if they encountered the notorious pirate, but these briefings often had the unintended effect of increasing fear rather than preparing sailors for resistance. The mere knowledge that such sophisticated torture methods existed was enough to break the will of many sailors before they ever encountered Blackbeard directly. This psychological terrorism reached its peak during Blackbeard's infamous blockade of Charleston Harbor in 1718. Rather than simply attacking individual ships, he had the audacity to hold an entire colonial port city hostage. The blockade lasted for days, during which time no ships could enter or leave the harbor. Commerce ground to a halt, food supplies dwindled, and the entire population lived in terror of what the notorious pirate might do next. The psychological impact of the Charleston blockade cannot be overstated. Here was a single pirate ship holding one of colonial America's most important ports, completely at his mercy. The colonial authorities were powerless to act, their militia useless against an enemy who controlled the sea approaches to their city. Citizens who had felt secure behind their harbor fortifications suddenly realized how vulnerable they truly were to a sufficiently ruthless and intelligent adversary. Blackbeard's demands during the blockade revealed the calculated nature of his psychological warfare. Rather than asking for gold or silver, he demanded medical supplies, specifically a chest of medicines for his crew. This seemingly reasonable request was actually a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. By asking for something that appeared humanitarian rather than purely greedy, Blackbeard forced the colonial authorities to grapple with moral as well as practical considerations. The delay in meeting Blackbeard's demands only increased the psychological pressure on Charleston's population. Each day that passed without resolution raised the spectre of escalating violence. Citizens began to panic, with some attempting to flee the city overland while others barricaded themselves in their homes. The social fabric of the community began to fray under the stress of prolonged uncertainty. When the medical supplies were finally delivered and Blackbeard released his hostages unharmed, the psychological impact was even greater than if he had engaged in a massacre. The restraint he showed demonstrated that his power was so complete that he could afford to be merciful. This mercy was more terrifying than violence would have been, because it proved that Blackbeard chose when and how to inflict suffering. He was not a mindless beast driven by bloodlust, but a calculating predator who killed or spared according to his own mysterious logic. The psychological mastery Blackbeard displayed during the Charleston incident became the template for an even more sophisticated campaign of terror that would define his final years as the most feared pirate in the Atlantic. But to understand the full horror of his methods, we must examine what happened to those who witnessed his mercy and lived to tell the tale. These survivors became walking advertisements for his power, their haunted expressions and nervous mannerisms serving as constant reminders that even Blackbeard's restraint was a form of torture. The released Charleston hostages returned to their families as changed people. Contemporary accounts describe men who would wake screaming in the night, women who could no longer bear the sound of wind in the rigging, children who refused to go near the harbor. These psychological wounds were deliberately inflicted, as calculated as any physical injury. Blackbeard understood that traumatized survivors would spread his reputation far more effectively than any number of corpses floating in the harbor. The genius of this approach became clear when examining how news of the Charleston blockade spread throughout the colonial shipping network. Within weeks, every major port from Boston to Savannah had received detailed accounts of Blackbeard's actions. But these weren't simple news reports. They were psychological weapons, designed to create an atmosphere of dread that would precede Blackbeard wherever he sailed. Ship captains began altering their routes to avoid areas where the notorious pirate might be operating. Insurance rates skyrocketed for vessels traveling through waters he was known to frequent. More insidiously, Blackbeard began using the Charleston incident as a psychological baseline in his subsequent encounters with merchant vessels. When approaching a new target, his crew would make sure the victims knew exactly who they were facing. They would recount the Charleston blockade in vivid detail, emphasizing how completely Blackbeard had dominated one of colonial America's most important cities. This psychological preparation softened resistance before the first shot was fired. The interrogation techniques Blackbeard developed during this period represented the pinnacle of his psychological warfare methods. Rather than relying on crude physical torture, he created scenarios that forced victims to participate in their own psychological breakdown. One particularly diabolical method involved presenting prisoners with impossible moral choices that guaranteed psychological trauma regardless of which option they selected. A captured ship captain might be told that his crew would be executed unless he provided information about naval patrol schedules. But if he cooperated, other merchant vessels would be attacked using that intelligence, potentially resulting in dozens of deaths. Either choice would leave the captain bearing responsibility for loss of life. The psychological weight of these impossible decisions often proved more devastating than any physical torture could have been. Blackbeard refined these techniques by observing how different personality types responded to various forms of psychological pressure. Natural leaders required different treatment than followers. Religious individuals could be broken through challenges to their faith, while practical sailors might crumble when confronted with threats to their family's economic security. This psychological profiling allowed him to customize his approach for maximum effectiveness. The physical environment Blackbeard created aboard his flagship was itself a form of psychological torture. The Queen Anne's Revenge had been modified specifically to enhance the terror experienced by prisoners and victims. Below decks, holding areas were designed to be disorienting and claustrophobic. Prisoners would be kept in spaces where they couldn't stand fully upright or lie down comfortably. The walls were deliberately painted in colors that created optical illusions and disorientation. Lighting in these areas was carefully controlled to maximize psychological distress. Sometimes, prisoners would be kept in complete darkness for days, their senses deprived of any visual input. At other times, harsh torches would be lit suddenly, the blazing light painful to eyes that had adapted to darkness. This constant manipulation of their environment prevented prisoners from developing any sense of stability or control. The sounds prisoners heard were equally calculated for psychological impact. Blackbeard's crew would create specific audio environments designed to enhance fear and confusion, Strange noises would echo through the ship at irregular intervals. Chains would rattle without apparent cause. Footsteps would approach prisoner holding areas and then fade away without explanation. These mysterious sounds prevented captives from sleeping properly and kept them in a constant state of anxious alertness. Most disturbing were the human sounds that would drift through the ship. Prisoners would hear conversations between crew members discussing their fate. But these discussions were often staged performances designed to increase psychological pressure. They might hear detailed planning for elaborate tortures that would never actually be carried out, or debates about whether to kill them immediately or keep them alive for extended suffering. The feeding schedule for prisoners was another tool in Blackbeard's psychological arsenal. Meals would arrive at completely unpredictable times, preventing captives from developing any sense of routine. Sometimes food would be withheld for days, leaving prisoners weak and desperate. Other times, elaborate feasts would be provided without explanation, creating confusion about their captors' intentions. The quality of food was also manipulated for psychological effect. Prisoners might receive moldy bread and brackish water for weeks, then suddenly be presented with fresh fruit and clean water. These unexpected improvements in treatment created false hope that was then systematically crushed when conditions reverted to their previous state. The emotional whiplash of these changes was often more damaging than consistent poor treatment would have been. Blackbeard's understanding of group dynamics allowed him to manipulate social relationships among prisoners with devastating effectiveness. He would identify natural alliances and friendships within captured crews, then systematically work to destroy these bonds. Friends would be separated and told conflicting stories about each other's behavior. Family members would be given different treatment, creating guilt and resentment between relatives. The most psychologically damaging technique involved forcing prisoners to compete against each other for basic necessities. Limited food or water would be provided to a group, forcing them to decide how to divide inadequate resources. These situations inevitably created conflict and resentment among people who had previously worked together harmoniously. Watching former friends turn against each other over a scrap of bread or a cup of water was often more traumatic than direct physical abuse. Blackbeard would also exploit existing hierarchies and tensions within captured crews. Officers who had been unpopular with their men might find themselves subjected to humiliating treatment in front of their former subordinates. Common sailors who had harbored resentment against harsh officers were given opportunities to participate in their superiors' degradation. These role reversals created lasting psychological damage for everyone involved. The interrogation chambers aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge were designed as the theatres of psychological horror. Unlike traditional torture chambers filled with instruments of physical pain, these spaces were crafted to create maximum mental distress through environmental manipulation. The temperature would be kept uncomfortably hot or cold. Strange odours would permeate the air. Mirrors were positioned to create disorienting reflections that made prisoners question their own perceptions. Lighting in these chambers was perhaps the most sophisticated psychological weapon in Blackbeard's arsenal. He had discovered that certain combinations of flickering candlelight and deep shadows could trigger primal fears in most people. Prisoners would be seated where they could see threatening shapes moving in their peripheral vision, shapes that resolved into harmless objects when looked at directly. This constant visual uncertainty created a state of hypervigilance that was mentally exhausting. The questioning techniques used in these chambers went far beyond simple interrogation. Blackbeard would engage prisoners in seemingly philosophical discussions about morality, loyalty, and survival. He would present complex ethical scenarios and demand that captives choose between equally unpalatable options. These intellectual tortures forced prisoners to confront fundamental questions about their own values and beliefs. Most insidiously, Blackbeard would use these sessions to convince prisoners that their suffering was somehow their own fault. He would present logical arguments, suggesting that their capture resulted from their own poor decisions or moral failings. victims would be encouraged to confess not just information about their ships and cargo, but their personal sins and failures. This psychological manipulation often succeeded in making prisoners complicit in their own torture. The timing of these interrogation sessions was carefully calculated for maximum psychological impact. Prisoners would be questioned when they were most vulnerable, often after days of sleep deprivation or inadequate food. Their mental defenses would be at their lowest point, making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. Questions would continue for hours, sometimes extending through entire nights, until exhausted prisoners could no longer maintain coherent resistance. Blackbeard's most sophisticated psychological weapon was his ability to make prisoners grateful for their suffering. Through careful manipulation of expectations and relief, he could create situations where captives actually thanked him for treatment that was objectively horrible. A prisoner who expected to be killed might feel genuine gratitude when sentenced to extended captivity instead. Someone prepared for elaborate torture might be relieved to receive only verbal abuse and inadequate food. This psychological inversion was perhaps Blackbeard's greatest achievement as a psychological terrorist. By controlling not just what happened to his victims, but how they interpreted their experiences, he could transform even his mercy into a form of torture. Prisoners would leave his ship carrying not just trauma from their suffering, but confusion about their own reactions to that suffering. They would struggle for years to understand why they had felt grateful to someone who had caused them such pain. The long-term psychological effects of Blackbeard's methods extended far beyond individual victims to impact entire maritime communities. Sailors who had never encountered the notorious pirate directly would nonetheless suffer from anticipatory anxiety about the possibility of such an encounter. The detailed stories told by survivors created a form of secondary trauma that affected thousands of people who had never set foot aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Ship owners began implementing increasingly elaborate security measures, not because they were effective against pirate attacks, but because they provided psychological comfort to crews who were terrified of falling into Blackbeard's hands. These measures often made ships slower and less efficient, imposing real economic costs on the entire maritime trade network. Blackbeard's psychological warfare was literally reshaping the colonial economy through fear alone. The recruitment techniques Blackbeard used to maintain his crew were equally sophisticated applications of psychological manipulation. Rather than simply press-ganging sailors into service, he would identify individuals who were psychologically suited to his methods. Men who had been traumatized by previous experiences, who harbored deep resentments against authority, or who possessed natural sadistic tendencies were prime candidates for his crew. The indoctrination process for new crew members was a masterclass in psychological conditioning. New recruits would be gradually introduced to increasingly extreme behaviors, each step normalized through group pressure and careful manipulation of their moral boundaries. By the time they were participating in the worst of Blackbeard's psychological tortures, they had been conditioned to see such behavior as normal and necessary. This psychological conditioning created a crew that was not just willing to follow Blackbeard's orders, but genuinely believed in the necessity and righteousness of their actions. They weren't simply criminals following a charismatic leader. They were true believers in a system of psychological warfare that they had been taught to see as superior to conventional piracy. This genuine conviction made them far more effective instruments of terror than mere hired thugs would have been. The network of psychological terror that Blackbeard created extended far beyond his own ship and crew. He developed relationships with informants in major ports who would provide him with detailed intelligence about potential targets. These informants weren't simply bought with gold. They were psychologically manipulated into believing they were part of something larger and more significant than ordinary criminal enterprise. Informants were former victims who had been so thoroughly broken by their experiences that they continued to serve Blackbeard's interests long after their release. Others were recruited through elaborate confidence schemes that convinced them they were working for legitimate merchant interests rather than pirates. The psychological complexity of these recruitment operations rivaled anything attempted by modern intelligence agencies. The intelligence network Blackbeard created allowed him to target specific vessels with devastating precision. He would know not just a ship's cargo and destination, but detailed information about the crew's psychology and likely responses to different forms of pressure. This intelligence made his psychological warfare far more effective because it allowed him to customize his approach for each specific target. The culmination of Blackbeard's psychological methods came during his final confrontations with colonial authorities. By this time, his reputation had grown so terrifying that the mere rumor of his presence in an area could cause mass panic. Entire ports would empty when word spread that his black flag had been sighted on the horizon. This level of psychological dominance represented the ultimate achievement of his terror campaign. Yet even as his power reached its zenith, the very sophistication of Blackbeard's methods was creating the conditions for his eventual downfall. The psychological terror he had created was so complete that colonial authorities finally recognized they had no choice but to eliminate him entirely. The fear he had weaponized so effectively would ultimately turn back on him, driving his enemies to desperate measures that would bring about his destruction. The psychological empire Blackbeard had constructed through years of calculated terror began showing cracks by the summer of 1718, though few recognized the signs at first. The very completeness of his dominance had created an environment where colonial authorities felt they had nothing left to lose. When fear reaches absolute saturation, it sometimes transforms into desperate courage, and this transformation was already beginning in the corridors of power throughout the American colonies. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy represented this shift in colonial thinking. Unlike previous naval commanders who had approached the Blackbeard problem with conventional military strategies, Maynard understood that defeating such a psychological terrorist required unconventional methods. He began studying reports from Blackbeard's victims with the analytical mind of someone trying to understand an enemy's deepest psychological vulnerabilities. What Maynard discovered was that Blackbeard's greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. The elaborate theatrical persona that made him so terrifying also made him predictable in certain ways. His psychological methods required specific conditions to be effective, and if those conditions could be disrupted, the entire system might collapse. The smoke and mirrors that created his supernatural aura could be turned against him if someone was clever enough to see through the illusion. The preparation for Maynard's final confrontation with Blackbeard involved psychological warfare techniques that matched the pirate's own sophistication. Rather than simply hunting him with superior firepower, Maynard crafted a trap that would force Blackbeard to confront an enemy who refused to be intimidated. The lieutenant spread carefully calculated rumors about his own intentions and capabilities, creating a psychological profile that would appeal to Blackbeard's ego while concealing the true nature of the threat he represented. The location chosen for this final encounter was itself a psychological battlefield. Ocracoke Inlet, with its shallow waters and narrow channels, was terrain that favored neither conventional naval tactics nor Blackbeard's usual methods of psychological intimidation. Here, in these confined waters, the elaborate theatre that had served the pirates so well would be stripped away, leaving only the raw reality of combat between determined men. When the two forces finally met on that November morning in 1718, witnesses reported an almost supernatural atmosphere surrounding the encounter. The usual fog that shrouded the Carolina coast seemed thicker than normal, muffling sounds and creating an otherworldly environment that felt appropriate for such a momentous confrontation. Both commanders understood that this battle would be decided as much by psychology as by weapons. Blackbeard's initial approach followed his established pattern of psychological warfare. He positioned his vessel to maximize the theatrical impact of his appearance, ensuring that the morning light would silhouette his smoke-wreathed figure against the pale sky. His crew had prepared their usual arsenal of psychological weapons, ready to deploy the terror tactics that had proven so effective against countless previous victims. But something was different about this encounter from the very beginning. Maynard's men showed none of the usual signs of intimidation that Blackbeard had learned to recognize and exploit. Instead of cowering at the sight of the notorious pirate's theatrical display, they maintained disciplined formations and steady nerves. This unexpected resistance to his psychological methods seemed to genuinely surprise Blackbeard, perhaps for the first time in years. The opening exchanges of the battle revealed the limitations of Blackbeard's approach when confronted by an enemy who refused to be terrorized. His improvised explosive devices and fragmentary cannon loads, so effective against merchant crews who could be panicked into surrender, proved less decisive against trained naval personnel who had been specifically prepared for such tactics. The psychological advantage he had relied upon for so long began to evaporate in the face of determined professional resistance. As the battle intensified, observers noted a transformation in Blackbeard's demeanor that few had ever witnessed before. The carefully crafted persona of supernatural menace began to crack under pressure, revealing glimpses of the mortal man beneath the theatrical facade. For the first time in his career as a pirate, he found himself in a situation where psychological intimidation was insufficient to achieve victory. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was unlike anything in Blackbeard's previous experience. Here, in close quarters, where his theatrical effects were useless and his psychological methods irrelevant, he faced enemies who judged him only by his skill with blade and pistol. The smoke that had once made him appear demonic now simply obscured his vision. The multiple weapons that had symbolized his power became cumbersome in the cramped confines of ship-to-ship fighting. Contemporary accounts describe Blackbeard fighting with the desperation of a man who suddenly realized that his entire system of power was crumbling around him. Without the psychological advantages that had defined his career, he was revealed as what he had always been beneath the elaborate disguise, a skilled but mortal fighter facing overwhelming odds. The transformation was as dramatic as it was final. The physical toll required to bring down Blackbeard became part of his legend in ways that ironically reinforced the very psychological terror he had spent years creating. The 5 musket balls and 20 sword cuts needed to kill him seemed to prove that he possessed almost supernatural resilience. Even in death, he was inadvertently contributing to the myth that had made him so effective in life. The display of Blackbeard's severed head on Maynard's ship served multiple psychological purposes that extended far beyond simple proof of death. For colonial authorities, it represented the triumph of legitimate power over criminal terrorism. For sailors who had lived in fear of the notorious pirate, it provided tangible evidence that even the most terrifying enemies could be defeated. But perhaps most importantly, it marked the end of an era in maritime psychological warfare. The immediate aftermath of Blackbeard's death revealed the true scope of the psychological empire he had created. Reports of his demise spread through the colonial shipping network with remarkable speed, carried by sailors and merchants who had lived under the shadow of his reputation for years. The relief was almost palpable in major ports from Boston to Charleston, as if an oppressive weight had been lifted from the entire maritime community. But the psychological effects of Blackbeard's campaign of terror did not end with his death. The methods he had pioneered continued to influence pirate tactics for decades afterward, as other commanders attempted to replicate his psychological dominance. However, none possessed his unique combination of theatrical genius and psychological insight, making their efforts pale imitations of the original. The survivors of Blackbeard's psychological tortures carried their trauma for the rest of their lives, serving as living reminders of his methods long after the man himself was gone. Their haunted expressions and nervous reactions to certain stimuli provided ongoing testimony to the effectiveness of his techniques. In some ways, these walking wounded were his most enduring legacy, proof that psychological warfare could inflict damage that lasted far longer than physical wounds. The academic study of Blackbeard's methods began almost immediately after his death, As colonial authorities tried to understand how one man had achieved such complete psychological dominance over an entire region, military strategists recognized that his techniques represented a new form of warfare that traditional tactics were poorly equipped to counter. The implications extended far beyond piracy to fundamental questions about the nature of power and fear in human society. The legacy of Edward Teach extends far beyond the waters where he once terrorized merchant vessels and colonial ports. His systematic weaponization of human psychology created a blueprint for terror that would influence not just maritime warfare, but our understanding of fear itself as a tool of control. The methods he pioneered revealed uncomfortable truths about human nature, demonstrating how easily civilized people could be reduced to cowering victims through careful manipulation of their deepest anxieties. Even today, 3 centuries after his death, Blackbeard's psychological warfare techniques remain disturbingly relevant, reminding us that the most effective weapons are often those that target the mind rather than the body. His story serves as both historical fascination and cautionary tale about the price of allowing fear to triumph over courage in the face of calculated evil.